Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to make a video on something that was kind of a huge aha moment for me in my understanding of trauma. And before we get started, I want to be clear that I am not a trauma therapist. I am a master's student in the field of attachment theory. So most of what I am educated on formally when it comes to trauma is trauma through the lens of attachment theory. So today that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about, but I want to just start out by making it clear that what I'm talking about today is not the one universal definition of trauma. There are many different definitions of trauma, many different ways we look at trauma, many different types of trauma, right? There is PTSD, there's CPTSD, there's chronic trauma, there is many different forms that trauma can take. But today I'm going to be talking about a definition that I found really helpful in my own understanding, and it came to me through studying attachment theory. So I'm studying something in my master's program called the dynamic maturation model of attachment. And what you basically need to know about the dynamic maturation model for now is that it is similar but not identical to the original model of attachment. So in the original model, you have anxious, avoidant, secure, and fearful avoidant attachment styles. In the DMM, you have 22 different attachment strategies. So instead of looking at the person as having an attachment style, which kind of in theory permeates through a lot more of their being, the DMM looks at which strategies you use, so which organized sets of tools you use to keep people close to you. And they call these attachment strategies. There's 22 of them. In a long series of other videos, I will tell you guys way more about the DMM. But what I think is particularly interesting is how the DMM defines trauma. So I am learning to code adult attachment interviews using the DMM model. And when you're coding adult attachment interviews to figure out which strategy someone is using, they teach you to look for unresolved trauma. And I found the definition of resolved versus unresolved trauma super interesting and wanted to share it. So basically, in the DMM community, unresolved trauma is considered incomplete learning. And I want to be very clear that this video is not a your trauma made you stronger video. That's not the kind of learning I'm talking about. What I mean is that basically trauma is looked at through the lens of this theory as a really physiologically overwhelming event that you haven't been able to properly contextualize and integrate into the rest of your understanding. And that's what defines it as traumatic. So a really big question that comes up a lot for people is, why can the same event happen to two people? And for one person, it's traumatic, and for another, it isn't. And the answer to that is usually that the person who was not traumatized by the event was able to properly understand, contextualize it, and feel as though they are going to be able to protect themselves from that same situation happening in the future. So when you feel like you have enough information about why a certain negative, overwhelming event happened, and you feel reasonably certain that you'll be able to prevent a similar thing from happening in the future, that's likely to be when you resolve that event. So you no longer have to be kind of continuously preoccupied with it, and you no longer have to have these extreme responses to it in situations where it doesn't make sense, because you've been able to understand the sequence of events that led to that happening, as well as which protective measures you can make to prevent it from happening in the future with a reasonable degree of certainty, right? None of us are 100% in control of our lives, but where we have unresolved trauma and where trauma tends to live in the body very actively for a long period of time is when we have events that happen to us that we didn't understand, that we lacked the full context for, and so our bodies and our brains unconsciously learned, okay, I don't really understand what happened here. So then one of two things happens as a result. We either become preoccupied with the trauma, or we dismiss the trauma. And both of these are considered unresolved forms of trauma. So I'm going to use a simple example to explain the difference between a preoccupied and a dismissed trauma. And these are not the only types of trauma. These are just the two main types that we look out for as kind of big, common types of trauma that you might have, at least in the attachment world. And that doesn't mean that these events had to be attachment related, right? If you're suddenly held up at gunpoint one day, that is very little to do with attachment, but your response is likely to be some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder response. Unless, let's say, you live in a dangerous area where you frequently get held up at gunpoint and you know which streets you can walk down that are safer and less safe, and one night you walked down a less safe street and you predicted you might get held up at gunpoint, and then you did, and it was by someone who had held you up at gunpoint before, and you knew that you probably weren't going to die because this is just Larry, the guy who robs people at the end of this street, right? Because you have all the context around that situation, it's possible something even as traumatic as getting held up at gunpoint might not be a trauma for you because you had all of the information and you were able to predict why that happened and how to not get held up in the future. And you were also probably in that completely fake situation that I made up, reasonably sure that you weren't going to get killed because this guy had held you up 3 times before at gunpoint, right? So the only reason I give that example is to show that an event in context can be not traumatizing, whereas the same event lacking context can be extremely traumatizing. And I also wanted to talk about the fact that we're not just talking about attachment stuff here. But interpersonal trauma is absolutely a thing that happens to many of us. If you have an insecure attachment style, a lot of people with insecure attachment of any type identify with having a lot of complex PTSD symptoms, which is what happens when you have repetitive interpersonal trauma in a relationship. So a series of threatening or psychologically damaging events that are not properly contextualized for you, that happen over and over and over again in your life, tends to result in CPTSD. So again, there's different types of trauma, and what I'm going to talk about today kind of touches on a lot of different types. So if you have a preoccupied trauma, generally what that means is that you haven't learned enough information about how to prevent that event in the future because you aren't really sure what led to it in the past. So this can lead you to feeling like you have to be perpetually alert to anything that might indicate that this thing is going to happen again. And often you are letting in way too much data to be considered as possible threats. So I'm going to use a simple example. I'm going to say that someone has been traumatized interpersonally through, let's say they learned that their partner had had an affair. And again, being cheated on, traumatic for some people, not traumatic for others. It's all about context. But let's say someone had a house and 3 children with their spouse, and then they one day learned that their spouse had been sleeping with someone else for a year behind their back, and now they are suddenly leaving them for this other person. Is that potentially traumatic to the attachment system? Absolutely. Absolutely. So if this person, let's call them Jill. Jill was cheated on by their partner. If Jill never understands the context of what led to her partner cheating on her, she might become hyper-vigilant to the idea that it could happen again in future relationships. And so the next time she starts dating, the next time she gets into a serious relationship, she might be on chronic high alert for any little sign that her partner might be disloyal to her. And she might be looking everywhere. So she might be thinking, okay, if they don't text me back, it's probably because they're cheating on me. If they look a little bit nicer one day, it might be because they're cheating on me. If they have a lot of friends who are women, it probably means they're cheating. And the problem with this type of reasoning is that when you have a preoccupied trauma, it's often because you are lacking the proper context for what led to the sequence of events happening that led to the traumatic event. So in Jill's case, she probably doesn't have the real information about why her partner cheated. So there are a variety of reasons why her partner may have cheated, right? Maybe it had to do with their relationship. Maybe her partner was very unhappy in their relationship. Maybe they no longer had a fulfilling sex life or had the emotional intimacy that they once had. And maybe that drove her partner into the arms of someone else. Or maybe her partner was a psychopath and was just chronically cheating on everyone their entire lives, right? But if you don't have the information about the sequence of events that led up to a traumatic event, you become hypervigilant to anything that your mind could possibly think of that might cause it again in the future. This is what we call preoccupied trauma, where basically you are looking at too many things as potential indications of future danger because you don't have the proper context for what led to that danger happening in the past. Now, you can also have something called dismissed trauma. So dismissed trauma is when you essentially omit the entire traumatic event from emotional processing and drastically downplay the conscious thought that it's going to happen again in the future at all. So this would look like if Jill's partner had cheated on her, and then she decided, okay, I'm just going to do what needs to be done. I'm going to move out. I'm going to take the kids. I'm going to go forward with my life. And you know what? I'm good. I'm okay. I'll get through it. There's no need for me to dwell on this. I'm just going to move on, which is, for many, a very common response to traumatic events, as is preoccupation. But the problem with this is that this will leave the individual with a numbed out set of emotions surrounding the traumatic event. So Jill might suddenly find that she is not attracted to anybody. She has no interest in dating, no interest in forming a close, intimate connection with someone, no interest in moving through the pain of what happened to her and learning from it and going forward in a different way. She wants to forget the whole thing happened, and subsequently, she buries the entire range of emotions she had around her old partnership, both the negative ones and the positive ones, and moves forward in a more numbed out way. So I was reading this book the other day on sexual anorexia, which is essentially people who refrain from sexual intimacy and who don't necessarily feel the desire to be close to other people in a sexual way, kind of like your sexual system just turning off. I can recommend some books on this if you relate to that, because I read some really good stuff on it. And this is not the same as being asexual. So often people who go through periods of sexual anorexia, it happens after they experience a betrayal in a sexual relationship. And I thought, yeah, that tracks really neatly with this concept of dismissed trauma. So if you had a sexual relationship with someone who you felt really close to, who you had a high degree of trust and intimacy with, and then that trust and intimacy was betrayed, assuming obviously in this example that you were monogamous, then dismissing that trauma is likely to result in you feeling kind of numbed out to any future situations where sexual or emotional intimacy are on the table, because you have to bury the entire set of feelings that you had around that thing. And as such, you're now going to be out of touch with yourself and your own needs and your own wants in this particular area of your life until you deal with the pain of that original trauma. So neither of these are great outcomes, obviously. With preoccupied trauma, you are on high alert, kind of chronically trying to figure out how you can prevent this from happening again because you don't know why it happened in the first place. And with preoccupied trauma, there's kind of this idea, not consciously, but like your unconscious thinks that you can still change the past. Like there is this part of you that's still kind of going, okay, if I can prevent this from happening again in the future, somehow the past is going to reverse itself and this trauma will unhappen. And again, that won't be a conscious thought that you have, but it's going to be what your body is kind of trying to chronically work out, is like, how do I make this unhappen? And with dismissed trauma, what your body is trying to do is protect you from ever feeling the pain of what happened. And in order to heal from both of these types of trauma, what has to happen is we have to face the full entire spectrum of what happened, understand both the sequence of events that led to it, as well as the emotional impact that it had on us. And we have to be able to integrate both sides of that in order to move forward in a way that allows us to protect ourselves in a realistic way from having a similar thing happen again in the future. Now, of course, we can't predict the future, right? No one can do that with 100% accuracy. But someone who, let's say, had been cheated on in the past, and it turned out the reason they were cheated on was because in their marriage, they both ended up feeling very lonely and unfulfilled, now has real information that might help them form a healthier, more connected marriage the next time around, so that it's much less likely they're going to get to that place where one person starts looking elsewhere. So a big part of resolving trauma is understanding the sequence of events that led to the traumatic event happening. And on the flip side, with dismissed trauma, a person who tells themselves the story, what happened had absolutely no effect on me emotionally, is at high risk of walking right back into the exact same situation or a very similar situation, not seeing any of the warning signs and having it happen all over again because they aren't even conscious of the fact that it hurt them. So until that pain gets brought into the body and processed and acknowledged, they're at high risk of putting themselves right back in another similar dangerous situation because they're telling themselves this is not dangerous, because they literally don't feel the pain that is usually there to alert us to the fact that we're in danger, physically or emotionally. So this idea that trauma is incomplete learning is the idea that every time we have a traumatic event happen, what makes it traumatic is the fact that we really did not expect it to happen and we felt highly threatened by it, either emotionally or physically. And a lot of the time people like to talk about trauma as only something that threatens your physical life, right? So there's kind of a dispute over like, what do we classify as trauma and what don't we? Any event where your life is in danger, especially if it's unexpected, is likely to be traumatic. But also the human drive to reproduce is pretty much the second strongest drive we have after our drive to stay alive, right? We want to stay out of danger, we want to protect ourselves, and as soon as those conditions are met, for most of us, this really intense sexual drive comes online. And that's just straight biology. Like, our species has continued for as long as it has because we have these sexual drives that drive us to go out and connect and reproduce. And like, whether or not you're actually reproducing through sex, your body doesn't know, right? Your body thinks every time you're having sex, like, ooh, maybe I'm gonna be reproducing through this, on like a biological level, right? Which is why sexual trauma often has as big an impact on us as traumatic incidents in which our lives were threatened. Whether it's assault or any type of betrayal from someone who is a romantic attachment partner, that is really dysregulating for the system, right? Because one of our strongest drives is to have attachment partners to help us raise the next generation. Our bodies and our emotional systems are literally wired for us to want to seek that out. That's often why we have all these really, really intense emotions that come up around attachment relationships, because our bodies are trying to secure an attachment partner for us to have safe, consensual, reproductive sex with, and then raise children and keep that partner close. And again, it literally doesn't matter if you've consciously decided not to do any of that with your life. Your biology doesn't know that. So it's very easy to be traumatized by interpersonal betrayals, is pretty much all I'm saying there. So again, in either case, you're never going to have all of the information that you need to make 100% sure that something is not going to happen again in the future. But we consider trauma resolved when you have enough information to feel calm in the fact that you're going to be able with reasonable accuracy to predict in the future when such an event is going to happen again, which means looking at the past event as complete. Looking at it as something that happened, that you process the pain around on a very deep somatic level, that you accepted you can't change, that you moved through the grief that comes along with not being able to change a traumatic past event, that you let go of the way you wish things had gone, that you accepted what happened instead, that you accepted not just the trauma that happened, but the impact that it had on your life, and maybe the ways in which it continued to traumatize you in small ways as your life went on, because maybe you developed PTSD and that impacted your ability to function the way you wanted to for the next 10 years. And those 10 years and the way that you wished you'd been able to function during that time might be an entire time period you need to grieve, right? But it's only once we have both felt the full weight of what's happened, accepted it, integrated it, grieved it, which let me tell you is a process, and then also felt as though we understood the sequence of events that led to it happening well enough that we now feel reasonably sure we can protect ourselves from that thing happening again in the future, or that we're at least giving ourselves a pretty good chance at that not happening again in the future. That's when trauma is resolved, when our nervous system is responding appropriately to things as they're actually happening. Right? The learning is complete when you have properly contextualized the sequence of events and also integrated the emotional impact of it. That's how we heal from trauma. And that is so much easier said than done, of course. and we will have many more videos on this. And I am going to get a lot more into, I think, what it looks like to heal from attachment trauma, attachment wounds, attachment injuries. That's what I'm qualified to speak to. I can't speak to trauma at large from a clinician standpoint because I'm not a general clinician. But I can speak quite a bit to attachment trauma, attachment woundings, attachment injury. And a lot of that absolutely meets the criteria for trauma. So more to come on this, but I just wanted to kind of share that definition that I find really helpful for understanding what it means to have trauma as well as what it means to resolve trauma, is that trauma is incomplete learning. It is when we don't have all the information we need to make predictions about the likelihood of that same thing happening again in the future. And the learning is complete when everything is understood and integrated and we feel more capable of moving into the future in a way that is responding to what's actually happening rather than getting triggered back into these old responses at any slight indication that that thing might be happening, or completely omitting the information that we should have learned and walking right back into dangerous situations because we deny the impact that they've had on us. Okay, that's all I've got for today on this topic. It's so nice to be back with you guys. I took a little break from YouTube, but I am super, super happy to be here posting again. Let me know in the comments any questions you have, any comments, any thoughts, any reflections that you're having on anything we talked about today. And as always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again super soon.